Christians decide every election in America. Did you know every Christian votes in every election? Did you know Christians alone decide every election? Did you know pastors are responsible for America's condition? Take note of these claims and ask God to show us in the next few minutes if they are His truth or not. If they prove to be truth, God expects you and me to take personal ownership of truth revealed here, then act if you love your God, country, church family, and ask your pastor to act on this truth now. Let's start with point 3 and then point 2 and finish with point 1. Every pulpit is God's alone. Every pastor is charged by God Himself to speak truth to equip Christians to be the head and not the tail, and leading our nation with the leadership of the church in every community, to educate and inform every Christian voter in every election how to vote for God's interests, then motivate them to take action, to vet candidates, to vote for God against His enemies. I offer you truth from 3 impeccable sources. Source number 1. My first impeccable source is Reverend Charles Finney, the 19th century revivalist and catalyst for America's Second Great Awakening. This quote from Charles Finney is the 19th century timeless, sobering truth. Listen closely to see how it is prophecy fulfilled in our nation at this very moment. Quote, "If there is a decay of conscience, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the public press lacks moral discernment, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the church is degenerate and worldly, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the world loses its interest in Christianity, the pulpit is responsible for it. If Satan rules in our halls of legislation, the pulpit is responsible for it. If our politics become so corrupt that the very foundations of our government are ready to fall away, the pulpit is responsible for it." Source number 2. My second impeccable source is Texas Pastor Rafael Cruz, father of Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Pastor Cruz is a spirit-filled patriot pastor born in Cuba who loves America and tirelessly sounds the alarm to pastors to do their duty. Watch carefully to this video of Pastor Rafael Cruz in this 2014 interview. You'll see that Pastor Cruz proves point 3, but also point 2 of these 3 points.
We are here for Breitbart, Texas with Rafael Cruz, who is the father of Texas Senator Ted Cruz, and we're here at the Republican Convention. How are you enjoying this year's convention?
It is terrific. There's a lot of energy here, a lot of people excited about taking the country back.
You know, one of the things I'd love to talk to you about, you've done a lot of work with the faith-based community and reaching out to pastors and different religious groups. What have you been doing? What's your philosophy behind that kind of outreach, and what's motivating you to do that?
Well, let me tell you where the motivation came from. A little over a year ago, I was at a pastor's conference where I heard a statistic that really disturbed me. The statistics said that in the United States there were about 65 million evangelical Christians, and that of that only 50% was registered to vote, and of the 50% that were registered to vote, only 50% actually voted in the last election. That means 3 out of 4 evangelical Christians stayed home That's over 48 million that didn't vote. I understand the figures are similar in the Catholic Church. I don't have the numbers. But when I saw that statistic, really, I got a real burden, because most pastors in America are scared to this. They're hiding behind their pulpits.
What are they scared of?
They're scared of the IRS. They're scared of losing their tax-exempt status. They're scared maybe of upsetting people in their congregation. And they give you excuses like separation of church and state, which is not in the Constitution, it's not in the Declaration. They give you excuses like, well, God just called me to preach the gospel. My response to them is, what is the gospel? Because the gospel is a lot more than John 3:16. The gospel is the whole counsel of God from beginning to end. And the Bible talks a lot about politics. As a matter of fact, the Bible tells you exactly how to vet a candidate. It tells you exactly how to decide who to vote for. When Moses came across the Red Sea, he was now trying to govern over 1 million people. And he was going crazy. And his father-in-law, Jethro, comes to him. And he says, Moses, what you're doing is not good. And then in Exodus chapter 18, verse 21, God says to Moses through Jethro, you select from among the people. Now note this, you select, not God appoint. You select, which is the same as you elect. And then he gives 4 qualifications. Able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. Able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. What does that mean? Number 1, able men. We need to elect men and women who are capable of doing the job. Number 2, such as fear God. Now, if you fear God, you obey God's precepts. We call that in America following a Judeo-Christian ethic. What is that? That is respecting the sanctity of life. That's honoring biblical marriage. That is honesty, integrity, hard work, individual responsibility, the rule of law, and yes, free enterprise and limited government. Number 3, men of truth. Haven't we had enough men and women of lies in government? I mean, it seems like this administration will tell you one lie to cover up the previous lie. And whether it is Benghazi or the IRS or the NSA or Fast and Furious or the VA scandal or now this new scandal with this traitor, this man who deserted, being traded for 5 high-level terrorists. It's one scandal after scandal, and it's lie to cover up the previous lie. It is about time that we elect men and women of truth. Number 4, hating covetousness. Now, something very interesting. Covetousness in government is not primarily about money, but it is about power and control. These politicians crave power, and they crave the control that power gives them over with the people. That's why they want to stay in government 30, 40 years. They don't want to give up that power. So there's how you vet a candidate. Exodus 18:21, but it doesn't finish there. It continues to say, and you appoint them as rulers of 1,000, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10. So it shows you a hierarchy. Moses, rulers of 1,000, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10. That's equivalent to federal government, state government, county government, local government. Verse 22, and only take up to Moses matters of great importance. Everything else you handle yourself at the local level.
So would Moses have maybe been a Federalist Society member?
That is the essence of federalism. That's Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That's the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment.
I love it. I love it.
And you know, people say the Constitution is a secular government. No, the Constitution is totally based on the Word of God. People do not know it because this is not taught in schools. 29 of the 56 signers of the Declaration were seminary graduates. They were preachers, they were theologians, they were men of God. The Constitution was written on the knees of the framers. because they were on their knees at the Constitutional Convention praying for wisdom from above. And it is reflected in the fact that this Constitution has served us for over 2 centuries. And now we have these liberal progressives tell us that it is supposed to be a fluid document that is not relevant to today. That's because they want lawlessness. They want to trample what has served us very well for over 200 years.
Well, getting back to your outreach with the faith community, what kind of conversations have you been having that have encouraged pastors to get involved, and where do you see maybe there's some potential for success in getting religious conservatives more involved and more political?
Well, you know, Thomas Jefferson said, if a people expect to be ignorant and free, they expect what never was and never will be. I think most of the fear is because of ignorance. Number one, no church in America has ever lost its tax-exempt status for speaking on anything. First Amendment of the Constitution gives us freedom of speech. It also gives us a free exercise of religion. It is a paper tiger. It's never happened. That is an unwanted, totally unwarranted fear. But the other thing is this, is that what we are seeing in America today is not something that the pastors can justify on biblical basis. Jesus said, you're the light of the world. But you know what we do? We go to church with our little flashlights, pointing the light on one another. We are great about criticizing one another, about gossiping about one another, but light is worthless unless you point it to darkness. That means you got to get out there in the marketplace, not inside the four walls of a church, playing church. But the other thing is this. Proverbs chapter 17, verse 15 says, he who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous, both of them are an abomination to the Lord. My question is, if we are silent, are we not justifying the wicked? Edmund Burke once said, all that has to occur for evil to exist is for good people to do nothing. So we got to speak out. As a matter of fact, Jesus said, shout it from the housetops. And the key verse, Proverbs chapter 29, verse 2, which says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, people mourn. And there has been a lot of mourning in America in the last 5.5 years. Because of this, I get across so many pastors, so many Christians that say to me, politics is a dirty business. I don't want any part of it. And just like Pontius Pilate, they want to wash their hands. Well, if you look at the message of the Old Testament, you look through 1st and 2nd Kings, every time Israel or Judah had a righteous king, the whole country moved in prosperity, in unity, in following God. Every time Israel had a wicked king, the whole country went to idolatry and chaos. The message is very clear. As the government was, so were the people. So we need to elect righteous people. But if the righteous say, I don't want any part of politics, I don't even want to vote, or I don't want to run for office, all that leaves is the wicked electing the wicked. So what we need to do is having people of principle, number one, running for elected office, and people of principle voting according to those principles for those people of principles. If we do that, we will retake this country.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit with me.
God bless you.
Did you agree with me? Pastor Cruz speaks truth. Let's recap. Pastors must lead in vetting and voting. Out of 65 million evangelical Christians in the United States, only 50% are registered to vote. And only half of those actually voted in 2008. That means 3 out of 4 evangelical Christians stayed home. That's over 48 million Christian citizens. 48 million Christians that did not vote. He said most pastors are scared to death, hiding behind their pulpit, worried about risking their tax-exempt status or offending, losing church members. Cruz challenges pastors to get outside the 4 walls of the church. Cruz said the gospel is a lot more than John 3:16. The gospel is the whole counsel of God from beginning to end. Source number 3. My third impeccable source is nationally renowned Texas pastor, Dr. Voddie Baucham, who deals with what happened with pastors today and the truth about pastor duties without apology. My kind of pastor. Listen carefully.
I do think it's true that pastors are held in less esteem today than they have been in the past. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think one reason for that is because pastors have held themselves in less esteem or lower esteem than they have in the past. There has been, in my generation, prior to my generation, this desire for pastors to just sort of be one of the guys and to not see themselves as distinct because of what we are called to do. And I think that's been harmful to the reputation of pastors. I think another reason for that is the role that pastors used to play in being a sort of conscience of the culture, and the fact that we have stepped away from that. The fact that we used to be the thermostat in the culture. We used to be the ones who were sort of leading the way and helping the culture think about things from a worldview perspective, from a theological and biblical perspective. We've now sort of retreated into our own worlds and into our own kingdoms. We're now building things for ourselves, looking inwardly and not looking outwardly at the responsibility that we have to engage and impact culture. Here's what's interesting to me. You talk to people about pastors addressing political issues, and their immediate response is that the church doesn't have any business in the political arena. Now, that's a very new idea. You know anything about the history of America, the history of the church, you know that that's not been the case. We've always understood that as our cultures face these issues, that it's the church that's uniquely equipped to address these issues. But there's an irony there, I believe, in our context. And that irony is pastors stand up in their pulpits now in our culture and spout psychology left and right. And nobody ever says, hey, this is not the place for psychology. But why do we believe that it's not the place for politics, but that it's okay for it to be the place of psychology? I'll tell you why. Because the other side has been effective in causing us to believe in this mythological separation of church and state that somehow makes it inappropriate for the church to have any say in what it is that the state does or thinks or how the state acts. If the church is not going to speak to the issue of truth and be a herald for the state and point the state to where truth is, then what's the only other alternative? The only other alternative is that man finds the truth in himself or in his courts. That's an untenable position. We cannot allow it. The Bible does speak to every issue in life, and our political issues are informed by our theology. There's no such thing as a politician or a political issue that is not theological. You cannot do politics without theology. So we have to, break this false dichotomy. I realize that there are pastors out there who are hesitant, pastors out there who are nervous or perhaps even afraid. And what I would say to those men quite simply is, remember what we find in the scriptures. Remember what Paul said to Timothy. God has not given us a spirit of fear. That does not come from God. We have to be reminded of that. I think also that pastors are afraid because they're succumbing to this fallacy of the excluded middle, that either, I am a political activist who's not involved with or engaged with gospel ministry, or I'm a real pastor, who would never touch on those issues. There is another way. Again, these issues are biblical issues. Let me put it this way. Nobody would have 50, 100 years ago shied away from dealing with homosexuality in those passages in the Bible that deal with homosexuality. Nobody would have shied away from dealing with marriage in those passages that deal with marriage. And nobody would have said that those passages were somehow political. Well, now all of a sudden, the government comes in, walks onto our territory, and because the government has walked onto our territory, we now say that it belongs to them. Well, I say, as a Texan, that dog won't hunt. They don't get to do that. They cannot come into our territory and then say that we're wrong for speaking about it. You don't get to walk onto my land and then say that I'm wrong when I want to plant something in my own field. So I think that fear from pastors comes from the fact that we've sort of been co-opted in many ways. These issues are not just political issues. These issues are biblical, theological issues. But beyond that, even issues that are political issues have biblical and theological underpinnings. So you got a two-pronged problem. Number one, we're afraid of something that doesn't exist, that somehow these issues are political. But secondly, we're afraid of something that we should never be afraid of. Nobody's happy about the advance of, people who want to change the definition of marriage. Nobody's excited about, the advance of issues like abortion in our culture. However, we have to be excited about the fact that lines are being drawn so clearly and that we have opportunities to enter into spiritual discussions with people like never before. And I believe we need to be equipped so that when those opportunities arise, we can use them as a launching pad for the gospel.
Now I have proven point 3 and some of point 2 from my words here, and 3 impeccable sources confirm it. Now let's prove point 1, that every Christian who claims the name of Christ, all 63 million Christians in America, all vote in every election. So Christians alone determine every election. Fact: every Christian over 18 votes in every election in one of 4 ways. Take a good honest look in the election mirror right now. Which one describes you? Which way do you vote? First is the default vote. Failing to vote, regardless of the excuse. Default is a vote for enemies of God to win every election. Elect whoever they choose, even if they are evil, immoral, or worship false gods and false religions against God. Not showing up for court gives your enemy a default judgment of whatever they want and make you pay the price for it. Not voting has the same result. Number 2 is a selfish vote, by voting out of ignorance, not knowing the issues or solutions proposed to resolve them, or pride in being a dumb sheep for any political party or selfish interest group who tells you not to worry about anything, just vote for the candidate that political party boss chose for you. How's that worked out for America so far? A selfish vote by a Christian is spitting on God's gift to you of liberty and authority to supervise your own government. Number 3, citizen vote. Voting, but it's not an honor. Resenting the time and trouble, feeling like it's a waste of time, that your vote doesn't matter. The election is rigged, the country is beyond saving, and you really don't invest yourself in the process. Or number 4, a patriot. By becoming informed, studying candidates' positions on key issues, praying, and casting a knowledgeable vote for candidates who most closely conform to biblical principles of character and the vital issues of the day. Christian patriots vote from a personal love of God and country. Now, do you honestly vote by default? Selfish interests as a citizen? Or are you a patriot that is thankful to God and country, knowing it's an honor from God Jehovah to supervise His gift to Christians of liberty in America for the purpose of advancing His kingdom on planet Earth, to be that shining light on a hill that makes God smile? Maybe 17 million Christians are patriots in America, but the other 46 million Christians are not. Every election in the past 50 years was determined by the 83% of all Americans who claim to believe in God Jehovah of the Holy Bible. Now, who is responsible for the condition our nation is in today? Not the president or Congress, but Christians. Most pastors would agree that voting by default or selfish agenda violate God's commands for His people to be good stewards of His gifts of liberty to supervise our governments, and have led to ungodly, unjust, and corrupt leaders being chosen, resulting in unrighteous government. It's still an accepted statistic that less than 1 of 3 church-going citizens vote in an election, a fact of which we should all be ashamed. Worse is that only 3 out of 4 citizens who believe they are Christians do not vote. That means 46 million Christians vote in every election by default, willingly handing control of America to people who are not Christians. I've proven the shameful case now that Christians and pastors are responsible for the shameful America that turned its back on God by default, not showing up, not even registering to vote. 46 million Christians voting as patriots in every election, which is our God-commanded duty, honor, and constitutional right, would have won every election in America in a landslide the anti-Christian forces never could overcome.